Morning, everybody. Welcome. Great to see you here. I'm Mike Saunders, and I have the great pleasure of chairing this session this morning. I'm CEO of Commonplace. For those of you who don't know, Commonplace is a data-led engagement platform for places. So we work with hundreds of councils and developers around the UK, helping them to engage positively with communities and stakeholders to help reduce risks and to improve outcomes from projects. So what's the S of ESG for us? Well, our vision for Commonplace has always been to create relationships and collect more and better information about how communities use places, so that our customers can use that information to inspire and sometimes accelerate changes to those places which are positive for the communities and for the local government organisations and for developers. So social value has always been kind of baked into our business model. And you know, I'm proud of the impact that we've helped to achieve with some of our customers. We have 6 million people who've used Commonplace now. We have audiences in most of the major cities in the UK and many other places as well. And we've contributed to some amazing, groundbreaking projects, which we're very proud to be associated with, and where the community has become a partner in those projects, which is really exciting. Just last week, we were certified as a B Corp, which is really exciting news for us, joining a community of almost 7,000 organisations around the world who are dedicated to impact. And so that's a fantastic opportunity for us. The built environment sector has, of course, been delivering social value for centuries. You know, it's the fabric of the places that we live. And so I think it's really exciting that right now there seems to be an appetite to work out how to use social value as a tool, and to hone it to perhaps be able to do something more effective. And I think there's a few things that are underlying that. There's demand. You know, I've seen an energised debate around ESG yesterday, the last year, and actually the foundation of this event has social value, I think, as one of its objectives, which is really exciting. And I think that debate's been partly led by COVID, by climate change, by cost of living, safety, Grenfell, and so on. There's lots and lots of underpinning issues. And partly as a result of that, I think that the term ESG has become mainstream. Somebody yesterday was talking about the number of job titles that contain social value, contain ESG, a kind of explosion of people working in this space, which is great. But the S of ESG is often a kind of a poor sibling to the E and the G. And somebody else talked about the S of ESG being a little bit like the Wild West at the moment. It can mean so many different things, from apprenticeships to clean air. And then finally, technology is providing opportunities, but there are also big questions about how technology is used. AI has been a huge discussion recently in the media. So I think there's some big, interesting and quite hairy questions to ask ourselves and ask each other if we're to find a way of using social value as a tool for better outcomes. How can it be sufficiently well defined? Whose responsibility is it to deliver it? Is it the market? Is it government? Is it the financiers? And how can we assess social impact, the S of ESG, in a way that is meaningful and helps us deliver those outcomes? And who assesses it? Is it us? Is it the communities themselves? So I'm really delighted to have a panel with huge expertise, who I know are going to provide lots of insight into chewing over some of these really interesting issues. From the left, Professor Sadie Morgan, OBE, who's the founder and chair of the Quality of Life Foundation and the founding director of DRMM, amongst many other things. Ellie Cosgrave, Director of Community Impact and Research at Publica. Wesley Ankrah, Social Value Director at Savills, and Selina Mason, the Head of Masterplanning, Director of Masterplanning, at Lendlease. So welcome, everybody. Just to kick off, I wanted to ask you all, just if you could give us a very brief summary of what the S of ESG means to each of you. So why don't we start here, Selina, if that's okay.
I was thinking 50-50. He starts with Sadie or he starts with me. Okay, right. Well, I'll kick off then. Right. So for Lendlease, our corporate purpose is to create places where communities thrive. We recognise that is that's a combination of creating sustainable economic purpose in a place, vibrant, resilient communities, and healthy planet, healthy people. I think that does recognise, just to make the discussion a little bit more complex, it does recognise that the S is intertwined with the E significantly, as well as economics too. So that kind of triple bottom line is definitely part of the conversation, and I guess it really is around how we weight the S relative to the other aspects. For us at Lendlease, we're committed to generating 250 million Australian dollars of social value by 2025, which is a kind of slightly abstract target in a way, given that that's a global target. But what it has done ever since we started looking at it more closely is made us think very carefully about one, measurement. What are we measuring? How do we measure it? And how do we work across our whole portfolio, locally as well as globally, to create a sensible sense of how this works and operates collectively together. But also I think we need to recognise that what we measure needs to come from the people that are going to be impacted by that. So to a large extent, this is around a conversation, a very local conversation around what is social value and what does it mean to those that are going to be impacted by the developments that we're working with, and how can we make that work best for them. And to that end, we've just published our community engagement charter, which we work with Commonplace on, which is again looking at how we can make sure that we're working collectively across our portfolio to look at this in a consistent way and ask the right questions at the right time and build trust, and start from that point forwards.
Thank you, Selina. Wesley?
I think for me, the most sort of pertinent question I always get asked is, what does the S do? And who's the S for? And I think when I first entered real estate, the social part was all based around CSR. So it was all based around what companies were doing to be responsible. But there's been a huge shift for me around actually not what companies do for its own people, but it does for other people. And real estate is probably the best sector to look at the S through that lens. When I speak to the clients I speak to all the time, and they ask me that question, I always go back to them with this kind of 4-pillar model of people. Because I think real estate, I said this yesterday in the panel I was on, that real estate is obsessed with buildings, but buildings are nothing without people in them. So I look at it through a lens of 4 pillars of people. The first pillar is, what social value are we creating for the people living in a building? If it's residential development, if it's an office development, what are we doing for the people who work in that building? And those are the two people that are most incumbent in the building on a day-to-day basis. But they probably have the least amount of impact in terms of what social value can create, because actually I think in terms of how buildings work and operate, what are people who don't live or work in those buildings, who are coming into those buildings, for example, going to be experiencing? And one of the things that I'm finding becoming more and more obvious these days are what's happening on ground floors in most buildings and residential developments or offices, because actually what local authorities want to see is inclusivity, is permeability between the outside space and the inside space. So we really look at it through that lens as well. And finally, I think the most important part is what is being created in terms of social value for people that will never come in that building. Because that actually is the biggest impact. We all see lots of residents, and obviously Commonplace see this all the time for the work that you do, who have no interaction with the building at all and feel completely excluded. But actually they're the ones that have to suffer from maybe poor air quality or noise or traffic or construction and the disruption to their life for sometimes 20 years if they're living in an area, but they haven't asked for these developments to take place. They haven't made any money from these developments. So actually, what's our responsibility within real estate to deliver S for those people that will never be involved in the building?
Brilliant. Thank you, Wesley. Ellie?
Beautiful. Thank you. So I think it's clear, I think, at the very top level that social value is about creating communities that can thrive right now as we're building, but also in the longer term, and making sure that the S, it really includes that 20, 30, 50, 100-year time horizon. And I think to do that, we need to think about three main things, or I'm interested in three main areas. The first is at that hyperlocal that Selina was talking about, which is to say that wherever we are, wherever we work, wherever we're working, communities already exist. Social value already exists in that space and place, and it is about working with local community organizations and individuals who understand their area very well already, understand the gaps and the needs, but also understands what's really working well. So of course there's a really local, fine-grained approach. The second thing is to also acknowledge that we have a structural system in place that often disempowers communities. So at the kind of national or system business operation level, communities are often designed out and disempowered from that conversation. And so I think it's incumbent on us who maybe have more power to be able to understand how those dynamics play out, how we talk to communities, how we understand their needs from a very structural and organizational point. How does that play out, and what can we do differently to ensure that those structural dynamics are minimized? And I think also we just have to experiment by doing it. And so we're not going to know what works well by thinking about it. So we need to be able to take risks and try and experiment in the ways in which we are rolling out the whole of our projects. And then finally, I would say that in some senses, in achieving the S in ESG, or our lack of achieving our ambitions of that, is sometimes a bit of a lack of creative imagination about what is possible, and being really clear about how can we create conversations, engagements that really allow people to imagine together the future that they want, that we all want to be part of, and to, you know, think really freely and have our fantasies around that so that we can bring it into being.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Sadie?
Well, the thing about going last is everyone said everything anyway. So, and when you kicked off and you were saying this is going to be a really difficult discussion, I'm like, I really hope we're not going to think we're going to give you any answers, because, you know, the thing about the S is that it's the messy bit, it's the really difficult bit, it's the bit that nobody really kind of, it's seen as the fiddly bits that, you know, in the conversations, and we're all here because we're all struggling to really try and understand what that is. And I think that the reason it is difficult is because it's about us. It's about you and me and how we relate to our buildings, what is our lived experience, and capturing that and measuring that is incredibly difficult. But we all know it's so important to do. And I think that is, I mean, that's something that obviously I've been really passionately thinking about for a long, long time through my work at Durham M, through the work of the Quality of Life Foundation. And I think you can bring all of those things in that you can do within your power, you know, good design, think about how we can, you know, think about legislation, you know, how do we organise our developments in order to, you know, kind of improve social value. But in the end, we have to find a way of measuring and determining how places work by asking people, and then looking at whether or not we have answered those questions, whether or not we have delivered on those asks, on that kind of lived experience, and do that over time. So it's not just, has it worked? Yes, whew, you know, off we go. It's like, actually, over time, are we delivering on our promises? Are we creating places where people feel that they are happy, content, safe, all of the things that people have described, that they have improved their quality of life through their built environment. And so if we can do anything today, it would be great to just, I don't know, listen to people's experiences, think about what's difficult, how can we overcome those barriers, take those risks, be honest about the difficulties that we are facing as an industry to try to measure and understand, you know, what the S really is. It's got to be possible, you know, and so I'm a huge optimist, even though it is very early on in the morning. And anyway, looking forward to the debate.
Thank you, Sadie. So actually, just to pick up on a couple of those points, let's start, if you like, at the other end from the kind of how do you do it, what the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, the problems, if you like, that we have in the housing sector and built environments in general. You know, is it sufficient for the community to say that they're happy and that they're have a good quality of life in the place? Are there other big challenges that we're trying to achieve with this tool of social value? How do you what sort of is the hierarchy of problems that you think we can solve with this tool?
Gosh. What are the hierarchy of problems? I mean, I think one of the things that we've done at the Quality of Life Foundation is to look, to do some research starting off. I think you can't be credible unless you actually have a kind of basis on which you're talking. So, we've done a nationwide piece of research. We've discovered that actually very simple things improve people's quality of life. Sense of belonging, sense of control, access to nature, freedom of movement, healthy homes, and really importantly, actually, I was on a great panel yesterday talking about the importance of culture and fun. So all of those things contribute to making a great place. But then I think it's how you prioritise those is where the nuance comes about the place and the people. So I think you have all the ingredients. Sometimes it will be more important to have better access to green space than it will be to perhaps be able to freely move around and have better public transport. I mean, these things are difficult. It's difficult to kind of everything's always competing, but you just have to find a way of prioritising, and finding a way of prioritising is to say to those communities, we can help map. This is what you do. We can help understand the nuances of your community and how within the areas that you understand, what are the places you like? Where does it work for you? Where doesn't it work for you? Yeah. And that is where you take a framework or a strategy and dissolve it into a much more kind of granular conversation, and you get a consistency you get a consistency with that method, but also one that is driven down into the communities in a particular place. So prioritization is always hard, but I think you have to do it in this instance within the communities that you're talking to.
So using the engagement with the communities and the information that you get from them to set the priorities.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Great. Ellie, you want to come in?
So I think this is ultimately about just more appropriate development, and the ways in which, when we genuinely engage with communities, and I don't mean consultation, I mean having the difficult conversations, I mean really understanding what the dynamics of an area is, you're likely to get more local support for projects, and developments are likely to be more appropriate. And what I mean by local support is not an easier or smoother development process. In fact, it might be more contested and more tense. But you will come out with a community. The ambition is to come out with a community that has deeper roots, because the development is appropriate to the needs of the place. And therefore that is self-sustaining, and you won't need to rebuild it again in 20 years' time. And I think also what the opportunity is here is to tackle the huge problem that we have of regeneration and redevelopment as pushing some people out to make it better for other people. And if we can do social value properly, then it will be about flipping that on its head and ensuring that people are able to stay in their networks and in their communities, which will make it better.
Thank you. And Selina, as a developer doing some really exciting, fantastic projects around the country, how do you? I mean, you have a new charter. How do you see some of those issues, and how do you use your charter as a tool to solve some of those things?
Yeah, we'll be using it to help generate those conversations with communities in the places that we're working, so that we can start to really unpick some of these things that Ellie and Sadie have been talking about in terms of where are the priorities for those that are living there, what does good look like for them, and to really then start to be able to, you can't prioritize until you understand, so it's kind of partly it's around understanding, evaluating, engaging, understanding more, evaluating more. You know, it is a consistent process of getting to grips with what's there, what's needed, and then constantly being able to come back to it and checking yourself against it. You know, this is very much a process, not a product, if you like. And I think it's really interesting. I like Sadie's comment about the messiness of it all, because the built environment is in its very nature kind of messy. It is full of compromise, prioritization, and obviously in the past, you know, we were, as you pointed out at the beginning, the COVID pandemic made us very, very conscious about the way in which the built environment has prioritized certain people over others, and their quality of life over other people's quality of life. And I think that that's where we need to get to, is to be able to really create a place that does work for the people that live there. But at the same time, I'm kind of slightly nervous of saying that we have all of the answers. I think to some extent also our cities do need to also retain a degree of flexibility, so that people have agency to change within them. You know, that no social value isn't of itself a static thing, I don't think. It will evolve over time as a place changes around it, and kind of having a built environment that provides a framework for people to live their lives well and adapt and change their lives as well is, I think, something that we should definitely aspire to achieving. And that's where these prioritization issues, I think, are really interesting. Is, you know, how do you, when you're doing a development, it feels like it's a very fixed place in time, but actually recognizing that cities need to be able to evolve and change in order to be able to accommodate those changes over time, I think, is one of the biggest challenges we have in many respects.
Okay, so thank you for those ideas, which I think are really super interesting. And I think the theme that's coming through for me is kind of thinking local, making sure that whatever we do, it's flexible and it's really rooted in the community. So Wesley, if we recognise that, you know, some of these problems and potential solutions are there, whose responsibility is it to work out and then try and deliver some of these outcomes?
I think it's all our responsibilities, to be quite blunt. That's the easy answer. But to break that down a bit, I think, you know, one of my biggest bugbears has been part of the sector is the lack of policy drive behind what social value should really be. You know, I've worked alongside the Social Value Act, and I've spoken to the people that have written the Social Value Act, and actually they've been quite honest to say that the Act was a good opportunity to create something, but what they didn't necessarily do with the Act was actually create a pathway to how the deliverables were going to be there for what social value was. And I do know that central government have always taken an approach with social value that it's a buzzword around election times, but then generally tends to die off after election, because it's, as Sadie said, it's a very messy thing. It's a very hard thing to put into policy terms. I've seen different local plans in their draft version involve and include social value, but then be dropped off by the inspector. And again, I understand why, because social value, should it be 24 policy points? No, it should be a golden thread throughout a whole policy. So how do you define that in policy terms? But there does need to be more guidance, I think, from central government. I think there's been so many missed opportunities, you know, with the MPPF and with the planning for the future white paper, where social value just isn't mentioned at all. And I don't think that's necessarily, you know, a strong position to be in for this sector. I think it needs more guidance, more standardisation, and definitely a clearer understanding of what we're trying to measure. I think, as Sadie said earlier, the measurement part is a real issue for me, because actually everything needs to be measured, but what we want to measure is very different for every single client or project that I seem to work on. So having a level of understanding what we should all be looking for to be able to compare things, able to compare data. I think there's no point in having a plethora of data if none of it makes sense, and actually it does need to be guided in some way. So that's the kind of government gripe I have. I think from the private sector, though, I'm definitely seeing how the private sector is leading this way at the moment. I think, you know, obviously creating your own charter. I'm seeing so many different businesses now creating their own calculators and creating their own charters and their own frameworks, which is really encouraging. But again, it does lead to that bit of a kind of disparity between who's doing what and where, and are we all doing the right things? Because when we look at environmental work, we're not all doing our kind of measurements around air quality and not sharing those and having different systems. Everyone really understands the air quality standards. Everyone understands that the building standards, the BREEAM standards, et cetera, but we don't have that certification really in social value yet. So again, it's that bit where the private sector is driving best practice, but isn't necessarily coming together to share that best practice. And I think that's quite difficult commercially. Obviously, there are commercial benefits to the work people are doing. People are investing in social value, and I think for me that's where there is a certain step change that needs to happen. Is that I've seen it through a lot of projects I've worked on recently, where social value has probably been the key driver to a planning consent. But actually, when you put the value of how much a developer would spend on its social value positioning, it's very minimal compared to what it will spend on its architect or what it spend on its cost consultants, and ultimately even what they sometimes spend on their communication consultants, because actually traditionally development hasn't really needed to involve social value. I think that there's a really serious conversation to be had now that people need to be putting a value on what social value really does for its projects and how it's being delivered. There's people I've spoken to in the audience before about this point, that actually you might talk about your preferred skills and abilities to unlock a project, but then you mention your fees and people are like, oh wow, that's really expensive. And I'm, oh well, yeah, but you're not understanding the skills you require to deliver this aren't cheap. You wouldn't go and spend money on a very cheap architect expecting to win a design award. Therefore, why would you spend a cheap amount of money on a social value tool that only sort of talks about social value in terms of a measurement context, but doesn't actually set the grounds for the impact it's going to create? And I think that's the key thing, is that social value isn't really understood in that sense yet. And I think that's the bit where the clients I'm working with at the moment are really starting to understand that actually there's a lot more to social value. It can actually really identify and create a brand for your business. That one of the companies I've worked with recently have now almost made it a staple of their development pathway and planning pathways to deliver a ground floor space that will either include a museum or would include a affordable workspace or include a community pub. And actually what I've seen working on those projects is that the narrative hasn't been about the use above, which has normally been student accommodation or has been hotels. It's actually been about the public benefit. And I think that's where the social value piece is really key, because ultimately, as I said before, it's not necessarily about who works or lives in those buildings. It's about how people can interact and engage with those buildings, which is a really key point. So I think sort of, people need to start valuing the expertise in the room when they have their design team meetings, when they have their project team meetings, because I am often in these rooms and I'm often the last on the agenda to speak, and that's kind of a bugbear of mine. But I'm thinking actually the social value piece is the piece that should be leading it. And being quite blunt and quite honest, normally within sort of the last couple of months, as the kind of sense around how the project's going, and sometimes a sense of panic setting in, it's Wes, what do you think? What can we do to change this around? And I'm like, well, this is what I was saying 10 months ago that should be at the priority. And then all of a sudden you do get more engagement with the teams, and I think that's the attitude. And I think I've worked with so many companies that get it, but I'm meeting lots of companies that don't. And I think, again, going back to the policy point, if it was a policy position, then people would take it more seriously earlier.
I think that's a really interesting point. Sadie, as I understand it, one of the aims of the Quality of Life Foundation is to find a way of kind of collective responsibility for social value. What do you think about that kind of balance between how responsibility falls and who should be kind of leading on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and it comes back to this kind of messiness, when it is... actually, I'd just like to say Selina's point about the fact that you have to leave it a bit messy is always really good. Was I think, a really well-made point. The responsibility is collective. I think it's, one of the reasons for setting up the Quality of Life Foundation was to try to encourage developers, house builders to come together and to do something about this, and to say, come on, we have a responsibility to think hard about the places, about improving people's quality of life through the places that we create. So, and the health and well-being of the people who live there. So, that's one, sort of not just talking about it, but actually just going around to people saying, come on, help me out here, give me some support to start this up, which the late Tony Pidgley, I have to say, did very generously to help do that among many others and many partners that we have. So I think that's super positive. When it comes to influence, I think I'll talk very briefly about the work that I've been doing at Homes England, and Wesley talks about the cross-cutting themes, the golden threads. these are the social values, sustainability. This is the golden thread that should run through everything, all throughout organisations. And Homes England has just published its strategic plan yesterday and set out its aims. And I have to say that social value and sustainability are very much part and parcel of that plan, and when it comes to the KPIs, we are going to be measured against those values, and that I think is really important. So if you are a big government organisation like Homes England, you have a responsibility through the money that you're given. I think it's really important that we find ways of leveraging that in order to make better. And so I agree that I think there needs to be much more kind of strategic leadership from government around this, and help us all to sort of put us on a guiding pathway so that we understand what is acceptable and what is right and what is best practice. The only worry about that is that often, you have to make sure that is ambitious rather than the kind of lowest common denominator. Otherwise, everyone just rushes to the bottom. So the minute you set standards, that is the minimum. That is your minimum is everyone's maximum. And I think, to your point, we have to look at the private sector, who are understanding that this is a USP. This is helping to, take their business and be competitive in a market which in 5 or 10 years' time will only be talking about these things. I'm so convinced. It's like, let's think about how we can be on the front foot, because it is coming. And I passionately believe that those who aren't thinking about this, who think, oh gosh, yes, it's all put it in a too difficult box, are going to be left behind. So we need to be in a place within those 5 or 10 years where we collectively understand what good looks like. So there is, I think, pressure to do this quickly, but also to do it properly. So that's why these discussions are so important. That's why understanding what everyone else is doing, trying to make sure that there is a common thread through it all. It's fantastic that, Lendlease are doing this and so-and-so doing that. But actually, if you're all doing your own and marking your own homework, then, that's a positive, but we're not understanding as an industry how we can pull ourselves collectively upwards. So, I think some help around that is long overdue.
Thank you. So, Selina, USP for Lendlease, I'm sure, and how do you see the responsibility as a developer, and also, that there seems to be a trend towards the flow of capital starting to take ESG as a set of criteria that need to be met. Do you see that? Is that something that is kind of figuring in your kind of modus operandi as a developer?
Yes, definitely. Investors are certainly increasingly interested in social value, as well as obviously environmental. That's absolutely evident. In terms of USB, obviously, Lendlease has always prided itself on delivering places where we don't just consider the economic values that we generate. We also deeply consider the social and environmental values as well, and always have done. Our founder was talking about it in 1973 when the company was founded. So to some extent, I think, yes, I would say tick, yes, it is our USP. I'll take that, thank you. But from an industry-wide perspective, I think most developers are now recognizing that social value is really fundamental. It's all part of our license to operate. In the UK, many of you in the room will be very, very aware of the way in which developers are now not regarded very highly by the community. And we're at the forefront of a lot of incredibly contested conversations around that. So I think collectively, we as an industry, and developers in particular, do need to be working together to really demonstrate to people that we're in this for the long term and we're in it to achieve better outcomes for everybody. That's super important. I think and the conversation, it's really interesting hearing the conversation, sort of the strategic one around kind of government intervention and creating a kind of level playing field. I think that will help in terms of this kind of, at the moment, potentially what the sort of implied vying for a position in terms of social value is amongst developers. To create a level playing field through regulation is important. But I would like to shout out for local authorities here, actually, because they're so important in this conversation, and most of our projects are working in partnership with local authorities for the most part. And we do find that the conversations that they have with us are kind of profoundly influenced by what they would like to see emerging out of their developments. And they're pretty tough. They hold our feet to the fire. You know, they want certain things to come out of it, and often in terms of it'll be jobs, apprenticeships. It'll be to do with visitor numbers and education. All of them will be driven by their own local requirements. So I think it's really important to recognise that it's not just government; it's also local government that are hugely influential in this conversation. But again, it's going back to the beginning of the conversation around what are we measuring. I think it is at the moment most of our projects will have metrics like X number of jobs. Now, whether that's, I think it would be really interesting to understand much more around, well, what is the social value generated by that, not just that number. It's a very crude mechanism for talking about social value. And, that's something I think I'm sure others will have views on that.
Wesley looks like he has a view on that.
Yeah, I just think, I'll take your point with the local authorities actually, but I do disagree slightly with that in the sense that I find that sometimes what local authorities want do not align with what the local stakeholders want. And actually sometimes they have an influence over what happens in a community. When I go into communities, I say, well, we don't want the new park. We've had plenty of new parks, and actually all the parks become our hangouts for teenagers. What we actually want to do is see more activation of activities for people who live in the community. And I said this, I always say this in every panel I'm on, we have a real habit of doing social value to people, not with people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think when I look at this kind of triangle I have in terms of my basic philosophy is that you have the real estate sector here, who are the facilitators. We're basically the bank. We are the ones that are basically paying for every new school, every new park, every new public amenity. Then you have the local authority, who are the custodians of policy and driving housing delivery. And then you have the community. The community should be at the top of the triangle, though. They're the longer-term stakeholder in terms of generational change. And one thing I will give credit to the sector for doing, since I've been in it for 8 years, there's been a massive shift. When I first joined the sector, I wasn't allowed to speak to people. It wasn't allowed. It was too much of a risk to engage local community members. Commonplace wasn't even around when I first joined the sector. And I think that says a lot of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to understand, in terms of the sort of Social Value UK 8 principles. Principle number 1 is involve stakeholders. So just in that 8-year period I've been in the sector for, I've seen a massive shift into that. But now we have to understand it's not just about engaging stakeholders and involving them. It's about actually utilising and working with them. One of my biggest issues I have is that when I talk to clients around engaged with the community, they always think about what can we do for free. So who can we go and speak to? Who can we go and do this? So who can we involve in a design session? Who can we do this with? Who can we do that with? And actually I'm thinking, this involvement with the community is actually adding a lot of credibility to your business and actually to the projects you're working on, but you're not willing to pay people. You're willing to pay the whole of your project teams, but you're not willing to pay the people in the communities that are going to be affected. So actually think about your supply chain. Think about how you could utilise the opportunity to not just kind of, create some sort of design purpose, but actually a long-term economic benefit by someone actually maybe becoming, part of the estate management team, maybe someone becoming the, the light bulb supplier for the building, and actually start to think around how the social value bit really works. But again, that can also be led by local policy, because local policy could dictate that, and we do have these Section 106 obligations around local supply chain spend, but there's no real definitive amount in there that says, you'll be measured against this in a kind of late stage viability type process. So actually we'll review exactly what you've spent in the local community at the point you're about to have occupation in your building. If you haven't hit those numbers, then you're penalised for that. But actually that money goes straight back to the community into a community fund or a pot, so it can be spent on what the people who are being affected living there will benefit from. And I think that's where I think local authorities, they are challenged, they are under-resourced, they have a lot of pressure on them, but there's still a responsibility for them as well as us to do better.
Yeah, and that they could be sometimes better clients, and we can help them to be better clients.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing as well, is better clients. There are clients I work with who 100% get this, Lendlease 100% get this. So I think in policy terms, there should be benefits for the businesses that do get it against the ones that don't. Because currently, as it stands, you can have developer A who has a site, a 1 acre site, and developer B has a 1 acre site. They can both put 500 units on there, and they're both treated in exactly the same way, the planning system. But developer B could be putting in a community workshop, it could be putting in a affordable workspace, it could be creating, you know, a massive green space. But they're treated exactly the same way, the planning process. And I don't quite understand why that is still, because actually developer B is creating social value and doesn't have to currently, and therefore shouldn't they be rewarded in some way for taking that approach?
Yeah. So we're kind of verging into possibly the messiest area, which is how do we measure what does good look like? How do we tell if it's good or not? Ellie, what do you have thoughts on kind of? I guess there's a spectrum, isn't there? There's kind of objective measures at one end, and there's very subjective measures at the other end. Where do we sit on that?
Well, I maybe I'd challenge your assumption that there's objective and subjective measures, because I think all measurements have a value system underneath. So sometimes when it looks like quite objective, because it's a number, it's just a truth, it's a binary yes or no, we can get very we don't see that actually there's a huge value system that sits under that. And when we talk about reported experience, which literally is subjective because all data, we kind of think that subjectivity is not valid, even though we all experience the built environment subjectively. So just maybe a bit of a challenge around what kind of data is subjective data more or less valid than so-called objective data, which might be a percentage point, which we'll derive meaning from, which maybe is invalid. So there's that. But I think more broadly, when we've got to think about why we're measuring, what is the purpose of measurement? And I'd say there's kind of two main things. The first is to know that we're on track. We have ambitions to create things. We don't know all of the answers about what's going to achieve the impact, and so we need to be tracking as responsible people how different interventions serve us differently. And then the second thing is about accountability. We have a role, and so how do we know that we've done it? My suggestion and my ambition and my hope is that we can work with communities in much more depth to work out what are the measures that matter to them. What are the measures that show that will tell us as a community that we have kind of improved our lot, that we're working together. And I think that, again, paying local communities over a series of months to be able to develop their own indicators about what good looks like for this development, making sure that they're paid, again, empowered through the life of the project to be measuring that. So there's a project in Brixton that really did train local businesses to collect data about how the area was changing. It enabled them to engage with their customer base more and be able to kind of hear back from other people what's working and what's changing, and then feed that back at a higher level. So I think community-developed indicators should be as much on a par with the kind of things that are more measurable, job creation, air quality, number of social businesses, number of apprenticeships that you've done. Again, these are numbers, but they don't tell you the meaning or the impact, and so we need to make sure that we're comfortable in interpreting qualitative data and that that's valued.
Yeah, great. And Sadie, I know you have lots of thoughts about lived experience and about how we collect that information and use it. How do you think we can do that in a way that also provides that kind of comparability that Wesley was talking about in terms of being able to benchmark in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting more and more sophisticated at it, but we're learning as we go along. And, we're working at Harlow and Gilston, as you know. And, through Commonplace platform, through urban rooms, through listening and trying to collate and engage with communities around what it is about their communities that improve their quality of life and take that qualitative and quantitative data and then overlaying it now with colleagues at Stantec with socioeconomic data you can start to map hotspots and draw those two things together. It's not perfect, but it's the beginning, I think, of a much more kind of sophisticated way of saying, making social value into a transactional kind of pounds and pence is really grating. But, I know that's something that we have to do. We have to find a way of, if we're going to engage those people who work in pounds and pence, then we have to find a way of managing that. So, I think the work there is really, really interesting, and is the beginning of a journey which I hope over time will show the impacts of particular interventions within that, within that environment. And then go back over the next 5 and 10 years to see, if those impacts have improved in terms of the data that is now being able to collect. So we have really sophisticated methods of collecting data. We have all of these sort of different places where information sits, and we have to find a way of drawing it together. And I think that's the big challenge, over probably the next year or two. But we are, I think, making great strides in doing that, which I think is super exciting.
Thank you. So hopefully we've started to unpack some of the issues and questions around this, and we'd love to hear your questions if anybody has any questions. I think there's a mic that's going to come around, so do stick your hand up. If you could just say where you're from before you ask, that'd be brilliant. The gentleman at the back. Towards the back. Sorry, yes. You.
Cheers, thanks. I'm Manu Day from Social Value Portal. So really interesting to hear what you've said. And I think Wesley picks up on a really good point about introducing social value within Section 106. And I think that could potentially lead to contractualising social value. So I'm interested really from the developer perspective as to whether we think we'll see the introduction of, say, social leases, or enforcing the living wage in tenants, or maybe even asking suppliers like property managers to procure locally. Do we think that is a solution, or would that hinder?
Thank you. We might take one more and then we'll... so, lady at the front here.
Good morning, I'm Caroline Pillay. I'm here on behalf of Newham Council. I'm really interested in your thoughts on the cost, if you like, of social value. Now, I come at this from the point of view of providers and how they build in the cost of social value, for example, into either their bids, whether it's it's Lendlease or whether it's a smaller organisation. It's an issue that I've certainly come across on several occasions where bidders have asked, well, how do we value it? Do we include it in our bid fee, or is it something that actually they swallow as a social value offering? But it'd be interesting just to understand your thoughts around that.
Thank you. So maybe, Selina, do you want to go on the Section 106 social leases question first?
Yes, I can. Certainly, in terms of local procurement, that is already having an impact. Certainly, in many of the projects we work in, Birmingham is an example where we have undertaken to spend. I can't remember exactly what percentage it is. Something like 60% of money spent on the development within a certain radius of Birmingham. So, and also there are other factors as well around SME, supply chain. Small businesses, etc., in the locality. So that is already starting to have an impact. Social leases, that's an interesting one. Certainly we're doing green leases, so I would imagine that's eminently possible. I mean, all of these things are possible in a sense. When you're working in partnership with the public sector, there's a conversation to be had, and we recognise that development needs to demonstrate its value and purpose beyond simply economic ones. So there's there's a conversation around, well, how do we go about delivering this value? What mechanisms do we need to use that will do that? But in terms of the longer term, I think the implications is that it's not just about construction you're talking about operational. And I think that is all to play for. There are certainly that's an evolving area, I think, in terms of how operate, because partly in a sense, partly because the way in which we're dealing with climate change is already getting us to think really carefully about operationing. The operations of our buildings has an impact on our achievement of our net carbon targets. So already that's in our eyesight, which I think in the past it hasn't been. You build a building and you leave it you leave it to operate itself almost. So I think that's definitely something that might be coming to the fore, and that's going to be an interesting conversation, I think, with local authority partners who might be in the room. Where do you see that heading?
Wesley, on the cost question particularly, how do you see that panning out, particularly from a local government point of view?
I mean, it's really tricky. I think that ultimately, every project, every procurement is different. And I do believe that it really comes down to the fact that it's not necessarily about money in terms of what actually social value needs to be about. Actually, it could be geared more towards resources because, and this is where I really struggle with the tendering process sometimes. SMEs really struggle with the tendering process because they don't have the same resources as the larger organisations. But ultimately, a lot of these SMEs sometimes are quite more progressive actually around social value and how to include it. So in terms of putting a cost on it, and this is where it is difficult around social value because we do look at different measurement frameworks that use financial proxies for the impact in terms of the kind of economic impact being created for a particular outcome. But ultimately, if you were to donate £20,000, for example, to a local homelessness charity that would empower young people into employment, that £10,000 has a greater social value than the £10,000 that's being delivered. So there's no perfect system at the moment. I do believe genuinely that this is where companies need to look inwardly and think about what is it we really need to do. We shouldn't be held to a question in a bid about what we want to do. We just have the principles and values within our business, and the culture of our business is this is what we do. And I think one thing that the tender process does, it steers companies in different directions all the time about what it is they should be doing. And actually, they might not be good at doing those things. People should be able to do things they're good at. There's no point in people in this room suddenly becoming youth workers because actually within a tender process said, go and engage young people. Actually, what you need to do is understand who are the partners in the communities that you should be working with if you win that tender, and identify those in the tender, and then actually then put a cost to it afterwards. Because I think I was seeing a panel yesterday when actually someone had a really good point around the fact that in terms of where social value or community benefit comes from, it comes from SIL. It comes from, which is the tax. It comes from Section 106, which is the kind of the negotiating point around affordable housing and other kind of infrastructure benefits, and then the social value piece. And I was kind of thinking, this is where it's quite confusing around, is social value part of Section 106? I sometimes think yes, I sometimes think no, because actually it depends on the project. Because actually I think sometimes you don't need investment of money, you need investment of time and resources, because so many different organisations struggle to pay for some of these resources that we have in-house as private sector real estate clients and businesses. So for me, I think the cost element, I'm not answering your question here, but I'm trying to kind of create the scene slightly that it's down to every single procurement. And I think that's where local authorities do have the power to say, actually, this is what we've identified that's missing in local communities. Can you provide one of 10 things we know are missing? And then it gives the organisations an ability to say, well, actually, we can do 2 or 3 of these really well, but not feel pressure to do the other 7 badly. And that's sometimes what can happen, I think, with some of the procurement and tender processes.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question, possibly 2. Lady at the front here.
Hello, my name is Ina, and I'm setting up a fund specializing in social infrastructure. And my question is actually a follow-on question from the one asked by the lady from Newham. I'm just wondering at what stage we will stop looking at social infrastructure as cost and actually will understand that if done correctly, that's actually the most profitable part of the development project. For example, the projects we have been looking at, for example, it's an office with a bit of a sport social infrastructure thrown in. It's a sport infrastructure that generates over 40% EBITDA margin. Where else would you find this kind of facility and it's booked from morning till night? I think the issue is it's not to stick it within the Section 106 and shrug and say it's a cost, but to think what provisions needed in each particular locality, how we can run it successfully. And my question is basically, I would like to hear the comments from all of you, but particularly Wesley, as to when we'll stop looking at it at cost, as a cost, and we will start thinking how it can bring extra revenue.
Thank you. We'll take one more, if anybody has one. Gentleman right at the back, sorry. Room mic.
Alan Carter, Chief Exec at the Land Trust. We've been measuring social value from the public realm around real estate development for 5 years, just on the basis of actually good is okay, even though it might not be brilliant at this stage while everything's coming forward. Do the panel have a view on when a kind of nationally recognised measure for social value will be accepted by all? How long will that be, and who's going to lead it?
Thank you. Sadie, do you mind if I start with you on that one? And then we'll come on to that.
You can, but I can't. I haven't got the answer. The answer is I don't know. I think my sense is that the next governmental cycle will be much more focused on this issue, and regardless of the colour of the party that will maybe be leading us in the next 5 or 10 years, I think that whoever will be in government will need to really think hard about this, and my hope is that it will be very much front and centre of the agenda, and therefore the need and understanding that we have to have something that is a national standard, that, as panellists, Selina, those who are investing have alluded to, need, I think, will be, I think it'll come. I can't see that we are able to operate and have these kinds of conversations for much longer in a kind of without that framework.
Great, thank you. Ellie, do you want to come in on the question about the kind of social infrastructure and it being a net gain rather than a net cost?
I think it's I'm torn, because on the one hand we want to acknowledge cost and resource and energy and time to create space to be able to do this kind of work really well, and yet we have to acknowledge that this is basic and this is central to what we're trying to do. Again, similarly to a golden thread, it should be involved in everything that good development should be, and that includes return. And so there's this kind of balance. How do we create enough space to truly get our heads around what this really means for us, and to be able to push the boundaries about what's possible, whilst also knowing that this is good all round. So there's no answer. It's like, let's do both. Can we do both? Can we say that this may cost money and return in multiple ways? And I think getting that case made well will be super important. And again, going back to my main point, is that the return is social return. And how do we understand how we include social return within our financial models and projections will be the key challenge.
Selina.
Yeah, I'm just listening to that. I think it's really interesting that you raise this, because it's to some extent part of the issue is you kind of track the money back to the investor. And what we're finding now is investment is getting more sophisticated. I think our built environment until relatively recently has been the product of some pretty narrowly driven investment models. Increasingly, we are seeing investors who are interested in long-term social value. They're interested in much slower returns, more patient return. And increasingly, I think that's probably where some of this investment will start to come from. I think the other thing to factor in, the other complexity, the other messiness of this is that it's not also about investment models. It's also, and for us as a developer, a lot of what we do in a development is around opportunity costs. The costs of one thing versus the costs of another. You might have an excellent model of a particular piece of social infrastructure that will drive a return, but if you put a commercial building on top of that, the returns are greater, and that kind of that's a pretty phenomenally difficult balance. So this is where we go back to prioritization. And the demands that are being placed upon us by the community, by local authorities and by government, all of these things have to kind of coalesce into something that is driven and clear and purposeful, so that those prioritizations are better made. And I think the other complexity here as well is procurement and local authorities. In some cases, local authorities have no lever other than planning, in which case you're into Section 106 and they've got to be clear. Where local authorities own land or have an interest, they're in a much stronger position to demand it. And thankfully, I think for the most part, they are demanding it now. And, I think it's remiss of local authorities who are not demanding it from local authorities, pretty much anywhere in the country.
Thank you. We're pretty much out of time, but I just wanted to finish off by offering the panel an ESG magic wand.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
And if there's one thing that you could wish for with your ESG magic wand, what would it be? And we'll start from the other end, if that's okay with Sadie.
Oh, my goodness. I suppose an ESG magic wand would shift the culture within organisations to understand the importance of social value.
I don't know what I'm going to say, so let's see. An ESG magic wand would make us ambitious and really put our hearts and our visions and all of our creative potential and power, and make us optimistic that we can do this well. So we'll be visionful.
I think my social value magic wand would be that social value is seen as an investment, not a cost, and actually that it's placed at the very beginning of every conversation around real estate development.
Oh, magic wand. For me, I think this is around. I'm kind of thinking about fearlessness, actually. I think in the past, developers and our employees have often felt very fearful of the conversations that we have with communities, because we are in a very contested territory. I think confidence and fearlessness. I kind of go back. I think the comment Sadie made around culture, I think, is super important. And increasingly, I think we as developers need to start looking like the community we're working with, so that increasingly our conversations are more meaningful, because they're about lived experience.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel for a really, really interesting discussion. Lots more to unpack, but I've really, really enjoyed it. Thank you all for coming, and really look forward to the development of this area, which I think is going to be absolutely fantastic and hopefully rapid and maybe slightly messy and very creative in the process. Thank you very much.